Wyatt Butterfield was one of the 10 men who survived the sinking of the USS Juneau. He earned it by diving into shark-infested waters with only a Bowie knife to retrieve a life jacket containing water and rations. His foot was torn by a shark, but he made it back to the raft. Days later, a PBY seaplane landed and pulled him from the ocean. But the story of the Juneau began months earlier with a ship that was never meant for battle. February 14, 1942. The USS Juneau slides down the ways at the New York Navy Yard, a brand new Atlanta-class light cruiser. She is built for speed and anti-aircraft fire, not for slugging it out with enemy warships. Her armor is thin, her hull light, a design trade-off that her new captain, Lyman Swenson, understands all too well. Swenson is a haunted man. A messy divorce has cost him his children, and he carries the pain of a daughter who refused to see him before he sailed. He buries his grief in the Navy, but he cannot bury his doubts about this ship. The Juneau is fragile, and Swenson knows that in a surface battle she could be torn apart like paper. By October 1942, the Juneau is steaming toward the South Pacific, her crew a collection of ordinary Americans thrown into an extraordinary war. Among them are the 5 Sullivan brothers, farm boys from Iowa, who enlisted together after a friend died at Pearl Harbor. They share the same bunk compartment and the same unshakable loyalty. On the same ship, 2 Rogers brothers are boxing their way through the long voyages. Far across the Pacific, a Japanese submarine, the I-26, slips beneath the waves, beginning its first war patrol. The stage is set. A fragile ship, a devoted crew, and an unseen enemy are moving toward a collision that will echo through history. By early November 1942, the crisis in the Solomons reached its breaking point. Admiral Halsey, newly in command of the South Pacific, had received word that the Japanese were massing a formidable fleet to smash Henderson Field and land massive reinforcements. He scraped together every available ship, including the fragile Juneau, and ordered them to intercept the enemy. Captain Hoover, commanding the cruiser Helena, would sail alongside Swenson's ship as part of a 13-vessel task group under Rear Admiral Callahan. The crews knew this was no ordinary patrol. The Japanese had thrown their best battleships and destroyers into the fight, and the Americans would be outgunned in any surface action. Half a world away in spirit but closing fast across the dark ocean, the Japanese fleet steamed south under the admiral's bold plan. The captain of the Japanese destroyer Amatsukaze stood on his bridge with a samurai sword at his side, a family heirloom passed down from his grandfather. He had studied the ancient warrior code, and he knew this battle would test whether he was worthy of that blade. The Japanese intended to slip through the slot under cover of darkness, bombard Henderson Field into rubble, and land thousands of fresh troops. His destroyer would screen the big battleships, ready to launch torpedoes at any American ship that dared to challenge them. Every man in the Japanese fleet felt the weight of the moment. Aboard the Juneau, the crew prepared for the fight ahead with a grim, quiet efficiency. A signalman checked his searchlight one last time, his mind drifting to his wife and the unborn child he had never seen. A young seaman tried to steady his nerves by joking with the gunner's mates. The Sullivan brothers gathered in their cramped bunk compartment, speaking in low voices about what might come. One of them told his brothers they would stick together no matter what happened. Swenson walked the decks, pausing to watch the men at their stations. He knew the Juneau was built for anti-aircraft work, not for trading blows with Japanese cruisers and battleships. The ship's thin armor offered little protection against heavy shells, but there was no turning back now. On the evening of November 12th, word came down that contact with the enemy was imminent. Swenson called his crew to general quarters, and the Juneau took her place in the American battle line. The Rogers brothers, Patrick and Louis, stood by their guns, exchanging the kind of quiet glances that only brothers who had fought side by side could understand. Ashore, the families of the men were going about their ordinary lives, unaware that the greatest trial of the war was about to unfold. The Japanese fleet was already rounding Guadalcanal, its lookout scanning the dark horizon for American masts. Somewhere beneath the waves, Commander Yokota and his submarine crew were moving into position, ready to strike. The stage was set for Friday, the 13th. Enjoying the story? Subscribe to join us for the next one. Just before dawn on November 13th, the Juneau's lookout spotted a dark shape moving parallel through the murk. Captain Swenson knew that if this was a Japanese ship, he would need another miracle. The Juneau was limping forward at barely 18 knots, half its potential speed, and its steering mechanism was crippled. Swenson could not maneuver out of a torpedo's path. His men, utterly exhausted from the night's savage fighting, could barely stand. Hitting the Juneau would be as easy as shooting a lame elephant. Swenson gave the order for general quarters and told his signalmen to challenge the shape with a blinker light. The crew held their breath. Then a signalman reported it was the Helena. Captain Hoover had assumed command of the remnants of Task Group 67.4 after a shell from the battleship Hiei destroyed the bridge of the San Francisco, killing Admiral Callahan. Hoover now informed Swenson by blinker of the disaster aboard the flagship. The San Francisco was heavily damaged with hundreds of casualties, but it was still afloat. Swenson signaled back his own troubles. Torpedo damage had flooded the forward engine room, the plotting room was out of commission, and he was down by the head 4 feet. He could make only 18 knots, and his steering was unreliable. He would follow the Helena south toward Espiritu Santo. As dawn broke, the battered flotilla gathered 6 ships out of 13, a grim remnant of the force that had sailed into battle the night before. The crew of the Juneau stared at the San Francisco in shock. Its superstructure was a mass of torn, twisted steel, punctured with huge, jagged holes. At about 11 in the morning, the task group was steaming past San Cristobal Island. The sea was calm, the sun shining, and men allowed themselves a moment of relief. Aboard the submarine I-26, Commander Yokota peered through his periscope and saw 3 masts, cruisers, and 2 destroyers. He had only 2 working torpedo launchers. The others had been damaged in a grounding accident. He would have to choose his target carefully. He aimed at the heavy cruiser, the San Francisco-class ship, at a distance of 1,500 meters. Yokota gave the order, and 2 torpedoes leaped from their launchers. The first missed, streaking between the Helena and the San Francisco, but the second torpedo found its mark, not the heavy cruiser, but the light cruiser behind it. At 11:01 a.m. on Friday the 13th, the torpedo smashed into the Juneau's magazine. The ship blew apart in a catastrophic explosion that sent a pillar of smoke and debris 1,000 feet into the air. The Juneau disintegrated in seconds. The concussion shook the Helena and the San Francisco half a mile away. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing left of the Juneau but a spreading oil slick littered with debris, mattresses, toilet paper rolls, clothing, and the bodies of nearly 700 men. Of the crew, perhaps 140 survived the initial blast, flung into the water amid the wreckage. They choked on fuel oil and gasped for air, surrounded by the dead and the dying. The ships of the task group steamed on, the survivors watching in disbelief as their comrades disappeared over the horizon. Captain Hoover, now the senior officer in the force, faced an impossible decision. He had 2 crippled cruisers and 1 undamaged destroyer to protect against several Japanese submarines that might be lurking nearby. He knew the Juneau had exploded, but he could not be certain that anyone had survived. Breaking radio silence could reveal his position to the enemy. He ordered the task group to continue south at best speed, leaving the survivors behind. Hoover did send a blinker message to a B-17 that flew overhead, reporting that the Juneau had been torpedoed and that survivors were in the water at a specific latitude and longitude. He asked the pilot to report the sinking to headquarters, but he did not stop. He did not turn back. The Navy's rule was clear. Radio silence was paramount unless an enemy task force was spotted or enemy planes attacked. Hoover followed that rule. The B-17 pilot, Lieutenant Robert Gill, also chose not to break radio silence, flying onto Henderson Field to report in person. As the task group shrank to a speck on the horizon, the men in the water began to understand what had happened. They had been abandoned. Some cursed the disappearing ships, others prayed that rescue would come within hours. A few, like signalman Lester Zook, accepted the logic of war. One had to make tough choices. But as the sun climbed higher and the ships vanished into the glare of the tropical sea, the survivors were left alone, with the oil, the wreckage, and the growing realization that their ordeal had only just begun. The oil slick was so thick it blotted out the sun. Men climbed onto balsa wood donut rafts and cork nets, their bodies black with fuel. George Sullivan wiped the oil from one face after another with wads of toilet paper, searching for his four brothers. His voice was already hoarse from calling their names across the quiet water. A headless torso bumped against the raft, and a man screamed. By the second night, the thirst broke their minds. Men drank the salt water and began to hallucinate. One sailor, John Grickey, swam a few yards toward a net. A shark rose from the depths and tore his shoulder completely off. Lester Zook held him as he bled out, his eyes glassy. George Sullivan stood up on the raft. He said he was going to swim to the island for buttermilk. 3 sharks hit him before he reached 10 yards, and the water churned red. A mile away, 3 men paddled a small yellow rubber boat. Joseph Hartney, Jimmy Fitzgerald, and the wounded Lieutenant Charles Wang had decided to make a run for San Cristobal, 55 miles away. Wang's leg was broken, the bone sticking through the skin. It had turned black with gangrene. He begged them to cut it off with his own knife. They refused. Wang began to pray to Mary, and a strange calm settled over him. A storm hit them with 40-foot waves. They paddled into the swell to keep from capsizing. The rain filled their mouths when it came, but the sun was a furnace. A seabird landed on the raft. Fitzgerald killed it with an oar. They drank the blood and tore the raw meat apart with their teeth. Later, a coconut floated by. When they cut it open, the stench was so foul they threw it overboard. On the main raft, Wyatt Butterfield stared at a yellow life jacket floating 50 feet away. A PBY seaplane had dropped it with water and rations inside, but the current was carrying it away. The sea was thick with dorsal fins. Butterfield remembered his father's words, "A Butterfield never dies young." He took a Bowie knife from George Mantery, shook hands with the men, and dove into the water. He stabbed a shark that rushed him and grabbed the jacket just as another struck his foot. He was pulled back onto the raft, bleeding from a gash in his foot. Inside the jacket was a canteen, some rations, and a crumpled note from the PBY pilot. It read, "Cheer up, lads, and sit tight. A destroyer is on the way." But the destroyer never came. Lieutenant Gill's report of the survivors had been filed in a routine operations log. Days passed without a single coordinated search. The destroyer Meade was sent to the wrong coordinates, found nothing, and left. The men in the water continued to die. On the morning of November the 20th, Lieutenant Lawrence Williamson brought his PBY seaplane down onto the open sea, a maneuver he had never attempted before. The swells ran 5 to 6 feet high, and the wind pushed them at 16 knots. Williamson held the plane steady as his crew pulled 5 oil-caked men from a balsa wood raft. Lester Zook, Wyatt Butterfield, Frank Holmgren, and 2 others collapsed onto the deck. Their bodies shriveled and burned. Butterfield was the first to speak, his voice barely a whisper. "The Juneau?" Williamson taxied through the rough water, searching for more rafts, but darkness was falling and the plane had taken damage from the landing. He made the difficult decision to lift off and guide a destroyer to the remaining survivors. Later that same day, the destroyer Ballard arrived on the scene and found 2 more men clinging to separate rafts. Arthur Friend was pulled aboard with half his buttock torn away by a shark. Alan Hayne, the youngest sailor on the Juneau, was so weak he could only wave his shirt before collapsing. They were the last 10, while the destroyer Ballard was still searching the area where the Juneau had gone down. 3 other survivors had already drifted toward San Cristobal Island, Hartney, Fitzgerald, and the wounded Lieutenant Wang. They had reached land on the morning of November 19th. On the morning of November 19th, Hartney and Fitzgerald awoke on a beach after their rubber boat had been carried over a coral reef and through a lagoon. Wang lay nearby, delirious. A group of natives appeared, fierce-looking in loincloths, but when Hartney spotted a Sacred Heart medal around one man's neck, he knew they were safe. The natives fed them papaya and coconut milk, then carried Wang on a litter through the jungle to the coast. From there, a canoe took them across the sea to the island of Santa Ana, where a German trader named Henry Cooper gave them shelter and radioed for help. On November 21st, 2 PBY planes appeared overhead. Hartney flashed a signal mirror, and one of them landed in the bay. Wang's leg was black with gangrene, and the maggots had cleaned the wound better than any surgeon could have. The PBY crew lifted him aboard and flew the three men to a field hospital on Espiritu Santo. Wang would undergo more than 30 operations over the rest of his life, but he would never lose his leg entirely until his old age. Hartney received the Legion of Merit for his courage in the water and for guiding the rubber boat to land. Fitzgerald received a letter of commendation, but the memory of the dead never left any of them. These three, together with the 7 men rescued by Williamson and Ballard, were the only survivors of the Juneau, 10 men out of nearly 700. Back in Noumea, Admiral Halsey had already made his decision. On the morning of November the 22nd, Captain Gilbert Hoover stepped onto the quarterdeck of the Helena to find his entire crew manning the rails. They had learned of his relief and had gathered to salute him one last time. Hoover shook hands with each of his officers, climbed into a launch, and was taken ashore. He would never command another ship. Halsey's report to Nimitz was blunt. Hoover had committed a serious and costly error. The Navy investigation did not go deep. Lieutenant Gill, the B-17 pilot who had seen the survivors and not broken radio silence, was asked a few questions and then promoted. The intelligence officer who had buried Gill's report in a routine operations log simply disappeared from his post. The full story of the abandonment was quietly buried, and no one pushed for answers. The nation had heroes to celebrate instead. In January of 1943, the 5 Sullivan brothers were declared dead. The news reached their parents, Thomas and Aletta, in Waterloo, Iowa, when 3 officers appeared at their door before dawn. Aletta had already dreamed of her sons calling for her. She received a letter from Lester Zook describing George's final hours, and she read it without flinching. The Sullivans became the most famous family sacrifice of the war, and the Navy named a destroyer after them. Captain Swenson was awarded the Navy Cross posthumously for his courage in the battle. Captain Hoover lived another 38 years, but the disgrace never left him. He met Robert Swenson, the captain's son, on a tennis court in Washington 15 years later and thanked him for understanding. Alan Hayne was discharged with a fractured skull, shrapnel wounds, and a broken foot. He suffered strokes, cancer, and heart disease in the decades that followed, but he always said that after those sharks, nothing could kill him. Arthur Friend recovered from the shark wound that had cost him half his buttock, then cycled through 4 marriages and a string of odd jobs, ambulance driver, policeman, welder, gold miner, river dredger, before retiring to a ranch near Fresno. Wyatt Butterfield was awarded the Bronze Star for swimming through shark-infested water to retrieve supplies, and after the war he worked as a salesman and later as sales manager for Mack Trucks, raised 3 children with his wife Genevieve, and retired in 1982. Frank Holmgren returned to Eatontown, married Teresa, and spent his career at a Navy weapons station, keeping a scrapbook of his ordeal and the wishbone that had brought him to safety. The story of the Juneau is not a story about a ship. It is a story about the men who sailed on her and the men who left them behind. 10 men survived, but 130 others died in the water who might have been saved. The blinker signals, the routine reports, the fear of breaking radio silence, the decision to steam ahead, these were choices made by men under terrible pressure, and their consequences were final. The names of the dead are carved on memorials, but the question of what could have been done is carried only in memory. If you have a family story from the Pacific War, or a memory of someone who served in those waters, we would like to hear it. Share it in the comments below, and we will read each one. Please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like to support our future historical documentaries. Thank you for listening and for remembering.